Hey there, a quick note before today's show. Every so often, we do this thing where we put out a survey to our podcast listeners. We ask questions about your listening habits, where you listen, what you listen to, how often you listen, and we ask questions about what we're doing, what you like hearing on the show, what we could be doing better. All of this helps us continue making podcasts that enrich your life and your understanding of the world. That is why we need your help. Take 5 minutes out of your day, go to washingtonpost.com/podcast survey and fill out our listener survey. When you're done, you can enter to win a gift card, including one that is worth $1,000. But even more, you will have our profound gratitude. Again, that is washingtonpost.com/podcast survey. Thank you so much, and here's today's show.
So the courtroom is packed. There are court officers who are walking up and down the aisles, making sure no one even looks at a telephone.
On Tuesday morning, my colleague Devlin Barrett was one of many reporters crowded into a New York courtroom waiting for the next witness to be called to the stand. According to him, you could feel the anticipation in the air.
And so when she walks in, I think there's some sort of silent version of, well, there she is, here we go.
This witness in the hush money trial against former President Donald Trump is a person whose account is at the center of the prosecution's case.
Trials are a bit of a roller coaster, and I think for a witness like Stormy Daniels, you know you're about to go on one of the wilder parts of the roller coaster even before she starts talking.
Stormy Daniels is the adult film actress whose real name is Stephanie Clifford. She alleges that she had a sexual encounter with Trump back in 2006, and that 10 years later, she was paid hush money to keep her story quiet. That makes her a key witness in this trial, where Trump is charged with 34 counts of falsifying business records related to those alleged hush money payments. And in her testimony on Tuesday, Stormy Daniels revealed details that were explicit and disturbing and could have important consequences for the case. Today, we're going to get into some of those details. From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Martine Powers. It's Wednesday, May 8th, and I am talking with Devlin about what happened when Stormy Daniels took the stand. So before we dig into what she actually said in court, I do want to just start by refreshing people's memories about some of the basic facts about this case. So just tell me a little bit more about Stormy Daniels and about how exactly most Americans first learned about her connection to Donald Trump.
So Stormy Daniels is an adult film actress. She would also like you to know that she directs and writes a lot as well. Mm-hmm. And she had I think most of us would use the term one-night stand.
Yeah.
She says she had a one-night stand with Donald Trump back in 2006. And that stayed more or less quiet for, more or less 10 years until Donald Trump was running for president. And depending on who you ask, she either started shopping the story of what happened to outlets that might pay for it, or, people in Trump's camp started trying to buy her silence to make sure that that story wasn't told, especially while he was a candidate. So what happened in October of 2016 is that a lawyer for Stormy Daniels arranges a deal with a lawyer for Donald Trump named Michael Cohen, for which it's essentially a hush money deal. Stormy Daniels is paid $130,000 on the condition that she never talk about what happened or never raise her claims. And it's worth noting, because it becomes important as this trial proceeds, it's worth noting that Donald Trump says nothing happened between them, that they did not have a one-night stand. But at any rate, she is paid $130,000 not to say anything about this in October 2016. And the reason why that's important to this case, Michael Cohen paid that money himself at the time and then was reimbursed in a series of monthly payments later by Donald Trump, is the prosecution theory of what happened here. And prosecutors say that was essentially a violation of campaign finance laws, because that money should have been recorded as a campaign expenditure and it wasn't. And therefore, that is the underlying falsehood that generates 34 charges by the Manhattan District Attorney's Office of falsifying business records.
Yeah, I think that's what makes this case a little complicated, is that at the center of this is, as you said, this alleged one-night stand, hush money payment, but that, like, the payment itself is not what is on trial here. The alleged one-night stand is not what is on trial here. It's about falsifying business records that allegedly occurred after all of this. So how did her testimony begin?
Her testimony began with a pretty straightforward explanation of her career. She started exotic dancing when she was 17. From there, she moved into doing pornography films. And soon after doing pornography films, she became more of a director as well as an actress. And then they asked her to describe, how she met Donald Trump and what happened that night.
And can you describe their meeting?
So they met, and there's a photo of this, so I think this part is not really in dispute. They met at a golf event at Lake Tahoe. She was there for her adult film company. He was there, I think, just as one of the celebrities engaged in the golf event. Mm-hmm. And she says Trump's bodyguard reached out to her that evening and invited her to come see Donald Trump for dinner. She eventually said yes. And according to her, she spent about 2 hours talking with him. And then he suddenly, she came out of the bathroom and basically he had started undressing. And then they eventually had sex.
And then Stormy Daniels starts to go into a pretty great deal of detail about the sexual encounter. Before we dive into that, I do want to be clear again that Donald Trump has said in the past that he never had sex with Stormy Daniels. And so he denies a lot of this. And I'm sure you'll hear more of that as you hear more from the defense. But the fact that this account was so detailed, I don't think that all of the details are particularly relevant to our conversation, and I want to be judicious about what we're talking about here. But this is something that the jury heard and that it might affect how they're thinking. So can you describe what you see as the relevant parts of the story that Stormy Daniels told about that night?
Right. So she offered a lot of detail as to what happened that night once they had sex. The details range from everything in terms of the where, how, and for how long. I'll be honest, I was quite surprised at the degree of detail that the judge let go before this jury. And I'll just say at the outset, the reason for that surprise is really about the legal issues here, because keep in mind, what Donald Trump is charged with is falsifying business records. What Stormy Daniels described to the jury was a sexual interaction where many times she suggested that sex was just not consensual. She talks about not knowing how she got on the bed. She seems to suggest repeatedly that she wished she wasn't there at all. She makes a point of saying she never said yes to this. She describes a lot of this sort of language that she used in describing the sexual encounter is the type of language you hear from sexual assault survivors. I would also just note that part of the reason why this became problematic, according to the defense and according to the judge as well, is because she speaks very quickly when she answers questions. What happened over and over in court is she would be asked a question and, she would be just sort of off to the races and just start talking very fast and saying a bunch of things all at once. So much so that the court reporter had to repeatedly ask her to stop and say it again more slowly.
And what was her demeanor like when she was describing this sexual encounter?
I think in some ways she came across as upset and disturbed and sad and embarrassed. I think that added to the defense concerns that this was all going to end up being very prejudicial against their client. And, one of the legal issues I think it is very important and frankly had come up just with this prosecutor's office as recently as a few weeks ago is there are, court precedents that say you cannot tell a jury about uncharged past, bad conduct, criminal conduct as a way to try to win a conviction of the thing that they are actually charged with.
And it sounds like what you're saying is that as you're hearing this, you're wondering, like, will Stormy Daniels' account here and the way that she described this sex that sounded not consensual, that it could pose a problem for prosecutors in the future because she's sort of describing what sounds like it could be a sex crime.
Right. There's a few ways to think about it, honestly. One is jurors will hear that account and think Donald Trump is a terrible person and be more likely to convict. The other way they might receive it is they will hear that account and, make some judgments as to, her credibility, but ultimately keep it in sort of a separate compartment in their minds that this is not what we are trying to determine the guilt or innocence of. It's just the backstory of how we get to the alleged financial crimes. And the third way that the judge or the courts may ultimately think about this is, this is just unfair. You don't convict someone of falsifying business records by publicly accusing them of sex crimes. And it's impossible to know which one of those things the jury thinks. And because it's 12 people, they could think a bunch of those things. The defense, I can tell you, was furious about the whole thing and said that the judge had basically allowed the prosecutors to poison the jury against him.
And they actually requested a mistrial, correct?
Right. A mistrial is when a judge declares that something so inappropriate, improper, and unfair has happened in the course of the case that it can't proceed. So after the lunch break, the defense got up and asked for a mistrial, saying it was extremely prejudicial, extremely unfair. The judge, I thought the judge's answer was very interesting. He denied the request for a mistrial. And if I could just take a step back for a minute, defense lawyers often ask for mistrials in the course of a trial, and they rarely get that granted. It's extremely unusual for a defense request mid-trial to be granted for a mistrial, but it can happen. I've seen it happen, frankly, with legal issues and witness issues that feel like less than this one. So in this case, I wasn't particularly surprised that Judge Merchan denied their request for a mistrial. But in doing so, he said a couple things I thought were important. One, he said, I told the prosecutors before this started to be careful and not go into too much detail. And they went into too much detail, essentially, the judge said. That's not a great look, to be honest, for the judge, but trials aren't perfectly clean things. You can't actually script what happens in a trial. But the other thing he said, which I thought was interesting, is he basically blamed the defense in part for not objecting more during the course of the testimony. And as an observer in court, I thought the defense objected quite a bit. They did not object at every single turn, but it was also clear as it was happening that the judge was going to let them do this after telling them not to. Like, one of the oddest parts of this, as she's starting to tell this story, the judge said to the prosecutors, you're really going into too much detail here. You've got to just stick to the basic facts. Do not get bogged down in a lot of in the weeds details. The prosecutor said, yes, Your Honor, and then immediately proceeded to get Stormy Daniels to talk about which hair care products Trump had in his bathroom that night. Pert Plus is the answer, by the way.
And why did they do that? Why did they want that level of detail? Like, what do you think the prosecutors were going for?
I think, taking prosecutors at face value, I think they want that level of detail because they want to show that she is telling the truth. That at the heart of this payment of $130,000, what the prosecutors are really trying to tell the jury in, bald terms is you don't pay $130,000 to cover up a lie. And so I think that is the core of what the prosecutors are trying to present here. And obviously the judge ultimately decided that this wasn't a catastrophic outcome.
Yeah. And so, as you said, one of the concerns about how Stormy Daniels' testimony could play out poorly for the prosecution is the possibility that the judge could declare a mistrial, but also the possibility that any conviction could be appealed. Like, can you talk about why this now creates potential questions for the future if Trump is convicted in this case?
I think there's always been an expectation that if Trump is convicted in this case, he is likely to appeal his conviction. The vast majority of appeals are not successful. This issue of Daniels' testimony, the degree of detail in it, and the way she describes that sexual encounter does give them, the Trump legal team, some material to work with in an appeal. And we just saw, and I say that because we just saw in the Harvey Weinstein case, a very high-profile conviction tossed out for an issue similar to this.
And let me just interrupt for a second for
Sure.
listeners who may not have heard about this. So last month, the New York Court of Appeals decided to overturn Harvey Weinstein's sex crime conviction in New York and have that case retried because, in their view, the witnesses in that case shouldn't have been allowed to testify about prior bad acts that weren't directly related to the charges that Weinstein was on trial for. So you see that kind of corollary here.
Right. The judge, to be clear, the judge has said, well, this isn't anything like the Harvey Weinstein case. I'm not sure the appeals court will agree with that in the final tally, but to some degree it doesn't matter because, Harvey Weinstein was convicted in 2020. It's now 2024. If Trump's vindication in this case doesn't come until 2028, how much will that even matter? And that's, assuming that an appeals court would agree with him. So, yes, I think there is a significant question here about a future appeal, but given the amount of time, it may not matter that much.
After the break, what Stormy Daniels said about the alleged hush money payment and how Trump reacted to her testimony. We'll be right back. So, Devlin, given the fact that, as you said, this is a case that is ultimately about a financial transaction and the documentation of that transaction, I do want to talk about the part of Stormy Daniels' testimony about the hush money payment itself, how that came about, how she experienced it, like what did she say about this alleged $130,000 payment?
Right. So she describes the event itself happens in 2006. There is a period in 2011 where she is talking to a gossip magazine and she admits that she, basically tried to sell her story for $15,000 and couldn't really get a buyer ultimately. So it seems like it might come out in 2011, but it's sort of only half comes out, if that makes sense. And then in 2016, the prosecution argument of this case is Stormy Daniels isn't important in the universe, isn't important to Donald Trump, isn't important to the gossip world until after the Access Hollywood video in which that the Washington Post reports in early October of 2016. And because what Trump says in that video is so damaging to his candidacy, suddenly Stormy Daniels and her story become more important. And so within basically a couple weeks of that Access Hollywood story, she is striking a deal through a lawyer with a lawyer for Donald Trump to basically sign a non-disclosure agreement in exchange for which she'll get $130,000. And so once she gets that deal, her story goes dark again for quite a stretch of time.
What did the cross-examination of Stormy Daniels look like, especially when it comes to this payment?
For one thing, the cross-examination began Tuesday. It will continue on Thursday. There's going to be a lot more fireworks when it comes to Stormy Daniels and her questioning on the witness stand. But so far, what we've seen is a very intense, very heated back and forth between Stormy Daniels and Trump's lawyer, Susan Necheles, who has really tried to hit the point over and over and over again in many different ways that her suggestion to the jury is that Stormy Daniels basically may have met Donald Trump once, but when she tried to sell that story without sex involved, she couldn't. So she sort of layered on a story about sex long after the fact to try and get paid for it. And that she is basically not an honest person, according to the defense lawyer, who is willing to tell lies for money.
And it seems like that is going to be a big question when it comes to what the jurors believe, right? That I think we do oftentimes treat with skepticism accounts from people who are being paid for their story, or they have a financial incentive to embellish or fabricate parts of their story. And that, like, with that in mind, are these jurors going to believe Stormy Daniels and her explanation of what happened? And will this level of detail that she described, like, be successful in convincing them that this was in fact real?
Right. Those are the big questions of this trial and the questions that the jury will have to answer. I still think there's a weird component of this because we talk about, the sort of complicated legal and factual architecture of this case. I still think there's a world in which the jury could, one, not particularly care or come to a conclusion together about the Stormy Daniels and Donald Trump night, and two, still come to a very simple and straightforward decision and verdict on the falsification of business records. I don't think you ultimately need necessarily all of this stuff about that night to still get a conviction. I understand why prosecutors think it helps them to get a conviction, but I don't think it's necessary, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do think, like, one of the ways in which her testimony, I think, is both important and risky, if that makes sense, is that I have seen from time to time juries decide that they are so turned off, disgusted, fed up with all the witnesses in a case that they just vote for acquittal. It doesn't happen very often. Most criminal trials end in guilty verdicts. But I have seen instances where a jury becomes so fed up, essentially, with
trying to kind of parse through all the details of things that they don't want to hear about.
These people are awful, right?
Mm-hmm.
These people are awful, a pox on all their houses, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do see that happen. That does seem to be, I think, the broad brush strategy that the defense is trying to use here, to say that all of these people that the government wants you to believe are bad people. And that's not the way to build a case. Again, doesn't work most of the time. It does work sometimes.
One last thing I want to ask about from what happened in the courtroom on Tuesday. We learned that there was a moment where the judge was concerned about witness intimidation from Trump himself in terms of how he was reacting to Stormy Daniels' testimony. Can you describe what happened there?
Yeah, I think that was a pretty important and significant moment because, one of the things that all the reporters are looking for is the degree to which Donald Trump may act out in court itself. Having covered a previous trial of his where he did a lot of that did not go well for him. And he's already had this judge in this trial find him in contempt of court for 10 different public statements he's made. This judge has warned Donald Trump that he may put him in jail if he keeps doing that. So all of that is the lead up to what happened when Stormy Daniels is on the witness stand and the judge pulled Trump's lawyer up to the bench and said, look, I need you to talk to your client because your client is audibly cursing and making faces while she's testifying. The judge said that he viewed that as a form of intimidation and he wouldn't allow it and he's not going to accept it in his courtroom, and told the lawyer, talk to your client because I'm not trying to embarrass him here, but this has to stop. And, I think that's a very high stakes moment in this. The interplay between the judge and the defendant here is very intense and I think important as to how this trial goes. And I think that instance is really a telling moment. And I'm sure that's not going to be the last conversation like this in this trial.
I think going into this trial, we've talked a lot about how this one was, whatever you call it, the runt of the litter, right? That compared with the other criminal charges against Trump, that it was potentially the weakest case and in some ways the most complicated or maybe hard for a regular person to understand. From what you've heard so far, and especially with this testimony from Stormy Daniels, which I think in part because it is about sex, people are paying attention to. Do you think the power of this case has been underestimated?
You're not going to love this answer, but I really don't know. I think this case is very important. It is the first time a former U.S. president has gone on trial. He is the presumptive GOP nominee, and he is, the judge has told him to his face, I may have to put you in jail if you can't stop talking about the witnesses. The stakes in all this are incredibly high. This trial, by its mere existence, was always going to be very important. And because it ended up going first of all of the indictments Trump has been hit with, of the 4 indictments, it assumes a place of great importance in whatever happens in 2024, whatever happens with the presidential race, and just whatever happens in the country writ large. I don't think the basic facts and premise of this case have changed because it's on trial. I think Trump being on trial, by definition, makes it important.
Devlin, thank you so much for explaining all this.
Thanks for having me.
Devlin Barrett covers law enforcement for The Post. And of course, as the trial continues, Devlin and many of our other colleagues will be covering all of the developments. If you want to stay up to date with the latest, The Post has an excellent newsletter focused on this trial and the other criminal cases against Donald Trump. It's called The Trump Trials, and it is very easy to subscribe. You'll find a link in today's show notes and at postreports.com. Other news before we wrap today's show. If you're a TikTok user, you might be wondering, what is going to happen to my beloved app? We talked on the show a couple weeks ago about the new law just passed by Congress. The law would force TikTok's China-based parent company to either sell the app or else face a ban in the U.S. Now, TikTok and that parent company ByteDance are fighting back. On Tuesday, they filed a challenge to this law in federal appeals court. They said the law violates the Constitution by trying to outlaw an app that's used for free expression. And they argued that the U.S. government overstepped by targeting a single company it dislikes, and by failing to consider alternatives to potentially banning TikTok. This is just the beginning of what's expected to be a high-stakes legal battle that will make its way through the courts. But any ban on TikTok in the U.S. wouldn't happen for many months or possibly years. That is it for today's episode of Post Reports. Thank you so much for listening. And don't forget, we would love if you could take our listener survey. You can find it at washingtonpost.com/podcast survey. Today's show was produced and mixed by Ted Muldoon. It was edited by Lucy Perkins. I'm Martine Powers. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from the Washington Post.